Good morning and happy Easter to you. For our lesson today, we are going to be skipping forward in the book of Luke from last week's chapter in 19 when Jesus entered Jerusalem to chapter 24. Or if you follow in your quarterly, it's going to be session 5. And the focus for the lesson today is the resurrection. A teacher's goal is usually to impart some new information or to teach a new skill. And with the Easter lesson, it's hard to feel like you're saying anything that hasn't been said or heard many times before. And that's usually the time where listeners tune out. And sometimes we take those lessons for granted because we have heard them all of our lives. But for today, I pray that our focus is to remember together and really remember and understand the importance of the crucifixion and the resurrection. Not necessarily the events, but the person. The night before Jesus died, he told his disciples, "Do this in remembrance of me." And he didn't say, "Remember all the lashes you saw me receive or the fake trial," but remember that I was the last sacrifice that ever has to be made so that you can go freely and straightforward to our Heavenly Father. After Jesus and his disciples entered Jerusalem, he still had opportunities to teach and to answer questions of the religious leaders. And, that was sometimes trying to find him in some reason that they could criticize. He would tell parables to clarify points that he was making. And he ate the Last Supper, which was the Passover meal, with his disciples. He went to the Mount of Olives to pray, and he was arrested. Following was a series of trials, physical beatings, and mockery. He was condemned to death by Pilate and crucified on Friday, which was the day before the Jewish Sabbath. Day begins at sundown or about 6 o'clock in the evening, so the Sabbath would have started at the end of what we know as Friday evening, and the next day, which is Saturday for us, the Sabbath for them, all the Sabbath laws would have to be observed. And the Jews did not want bodies hanging on the crosses during the Sabbath. Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Jewish ruling council, but he did not agree with the Sanhedrin's goal of putting Jesus to death. He had recently had a tomb carved for burial of himself and his family, but so far the tomb had not been used. And after Jesus died, he got permission from the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, to remove Jesus' body and to bury him. And with the help of Nicodemus, who was also a member of the Sanhedrin, the two men hurriedly buried Jesus in Joseph's tomb. Now, they did wrap his body, and maybe they did put some oils, but that was really not to be known. His body was wrapped. But there were several women who were at the crucifixion, and they followed at a distance. The disciples had gone away, so they were not there. But the approach was coming of the Sabbath, and so these women had to get back to the city, but they did follow along far enough that they saw the place where Jesus' body was placed. They went back and they began preparing spices for their planned return to the tomb once the Sabbath had passed. Now, Jews typically took great care in preparing a body for burial. The family or someone in the family would wash the body, they would rub it in oils and spices and wrap it in cloths. But they had no time for this proper burial of Jesus. But his body was wrapped by Joseph and Nicodemus before he was placed in the tomb, and maybe there were some oil or spices used. But a stone was rolled in front of the opening to the tomb. Now, this was customary to seal in the odor of decay and to keep animals and grave robbers out. What wasn't customary was having two guards placed outside by the authority of Pontius Pilate. There were not too many pictures of courage among the people surrounding Jesus' arrest and crucifixion. Judas stood out as a greedy traitor. The religious leaders made false charges against him, which made them liars. The Roman governor, Pilate, was a weak man who condemned him to death despite the fact that he could find no fault with this man. The soldiers mocked and beat a prisoner who offered no resistance. 11 disciples fled in fear when he was arrested. And Peter, the self-appointed or maybe the appointed leader of the 11, even denied Jesus not one time, but 3 times. But then we read about some brave women, which brings us to the first scriptures for today. And that would be from chapter 24, verses 1 through the first part of verse 5. And it says, on the first day of the week, very early in the morning, there came to the tomb, bringing the spices they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb. They went in, but did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly 2 men stood by them in dazzling clothes. So the women were terrified and bowed down to the ground. It's not sure if the women knew that the guards were placed at the tomb, but they did know that a rock would be at the entrance because that was customary. And their little journey started early in the morning, which would be our Sunday. While it was still dark, they started out with their spices. They may have been discussing how they would roll that stone away, but with all of their efforts combined, they must have had the confidence to do it. They loved Jesus, and they were determined to carry out one last act of service for him. But when they got there, they found the stone had already been moved. There were no soldiers at the site at that time because they had left to report the incident of the stone being moved away. The women went into the tomb and saw only the cloth that had wrapped Jesus' body. They probably got out of there pretty quickly, and they were probably stunned, not knowing what to think or to do next. Probably their initial thought was that someone had stolen his body. But then suddenly 2 men, glowing, dazzling men, stood before them, angels that were manifested as men. And out of fear, the women bowed down before the men, and the men began to speak, as we will see in the next scriptures, which would be the second part of verse 5 down through 7. Why are you looking for the living among the dead? Asked the men. He is not here, but he is risen. Remember how he spoke to you when he was still in Galilee, saying, it is necessary that the Son of Man be betrayed into the hands of sinful men, be crucified, and rise on the 3rd day? The angels simply asked why they would be looking for a living person among the dead, which was preparing them for the announcement of the resurrection. Now, as courageous and faithful as these women had been, they failed to fully understand that the promises that Jesus had been making to his followers, that he would rise 3 days after his death. The angels prompted them to remember how Jesus had spoken to them when he was in Galilee. Well, just like the other followers, they didn't want to believe that Jesus was telling them about his death on the cross. And we're guilty of the same human trait. We believe what we want to believe, good or bad, and we block from our minds what we don't want to believe, good or bad. Witnessing all that had taken place the previous week had probably set them into a state of shock, and I'm sure we would have been the same way. They had seen him arrested, they had seen him beaten, and they had seen him crucified. The angels went on to explain that what happened to Jesus was necessary. He had told them that, but it was not the end of his story. He said he would rise on the 3rd day, and he did. And as the women listened, they must have realized, well, we're standing here on the 3rd day because he was crucified on Friday. Then they had the Sabbath, which was this next day. And maybe their despair then turned into an overwhelming excitement and a need to tell others what they had seen and heard. Now we'll go to verses 8 through 12. And they remembered his words. Returning from the tomb, they reported all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them were telling the disciples these things. But these words seemed like nonsense to them, and they did not believe the women. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. When he stooped in, he saw only the linen cloths, so he went away amazed at what had happened. In these verses, the women were named. Mary Magdalene accompanied the disciples when they traveled. Jesus had cast demons out of her and had transformed her life. Joanna was the wife of one of Herod's stewards, and she had been healed by Jesus and afterwards supported him. Mary, the mother of James, was sometimes also referred to as the other Mary, meaning she was not the mother of Jesus, but she was the mother of one of his apostles, James. And there were other women with these, and you can imagine the chatter as they hurriedly returned to the city to tell the disciples. When they reached the place where the disciples were, in all the excitement, they probably all talked at the same time, just like we do. They had experienced something remarkable and couldn't wait or take turns to tell it. The apostles may have had a hard time understanding what they were saying, but once they did understand, they really didn't believe it. None of Jesus' followers had expected him to be alive. They had seen him die, and they considered the chatter of these women to be pure nonsense, maybe just women wishful thinking. But even so, Peter and John ran to the tomb and found it just as the women had said. The stone was rolled away, and when Peter stooped in, he saw the cloths that had wrapped Jesus' body were lying in a heap. The cover, however, that had been placed over his face was folded and lying on the shelf where his body had been. Now, this was significant in Hebrew culture. A wadded napkin meant that the master had finished with the meal and would not return to the table. A folded napkin meant that he was coming back, which was another signal that Jesus literally meant all the teachings he had given the disciples. He was alive and he was returning. The two men must have been stunned, to say the least. None of the disciples had fully comprehended the lessons that Jesus had given to them and the forewarning that he had given to them or the prophesied resurrection. They just didn't quite comprehend that. All people must respond to this empty tomb that Peter found that day and that the women found. We cannot escape its reality, and we shouldn't want to. Anyone who searches for truth has to look inside that open tomb and decide what it means for them. When we don't remember the promises of God, we worry and we fret. The disciples and the people that followed Jesus didn't remember the promises that he made, and they were in a state of despair at his death. They didn't remember what he had said would take place. And when we're faced with a great challenge, sometimes we fail to trust that God is going to take care of us as he promised. We might fail to believe that all things work together for the good to those who love him. We know the promises that God has made, and we can probably quote the scriptures. But when it comes to trusting those promises by faith in a real time crisis, we often falter. Thankfully, the Lord is merciful and he's patient with us. So let's all be more diligent in allowing God to handle our troubles. Pray, leave it at the foot of the cross, and leave it there. Walk away and leave it there. I want to thank you for joining in today. I hope you have a blessed day and a blessed week, and that we can learn to rely more and more on God for our daily lives, in our church, in our country, and in every issue that we encounter. Thank you for your time today.